On October 20th, 1944, in London, the underground briefing room of the political warfare executive always smelled of stale paper and nervous sweat, and the smoke hung so thick you could almost write in it. It softened the edges of faces and maps alike, turning the room into a gray aquarium where men spoke as if sound itself had to push through resistance. A desk lamp lit clipped memoranda, a half-empty ashtray, and the bright heads of map pins. Somewhere behind the map board, a typewriter chattered on with the indifferent rhythm of clerical certainty, as if the war were merely a set of forms to be filed. Richard Perry stood before a huge map of Western Europe and felt the pressure on his shoulders like the black arrows marking German Panzer divisions, cold, heavy, and aimed straight at him. He kept his posture still, but his fingers worried the wooden frame of the map, tracing the coastline without meaning to. The arrows on paper did not move, yet they seemed to lean inward. His direct superior, Jeremy Crawford, a former diplomat who had a habit of rapping his knuckles on the tabletop, had just delivered the higher-ups' nearly brutal expectations. Rommel is dead. Berlin says he died of his wounds. We both know that may be a pack of lies. Perry, your job is to use this. Hit them hard, fast, loud. Make the morale of their core formations shake. The eyes of several colleagues swung toward him. Pity mixed with appraisal and a hint of, let's see how you get out of this. The problem was that Perry had no hammer with which to hit anyone. Over the past 72 hours, he had sifted every intelligence summary he could touch. The government code and cipher schools decrypts, heavily laundered, showed only that German internal messaging was consistent. Early prisoner interrogations contained shock and grief, but little direct evidence for conspiracies. Even the special operations executives' scattered fragments from the continent could not be assembled into the clean propaganda picture the cabinet wanted. Perry was staring at a fog of possibilities, not a stone he could throw. If they rashly pushed a murder narrative and the Germans refuted it easily, they might instead turn Rommel into a martyr, an admired commander smeared by a contemptible enemy. That would be a catastrophe. "We need time, sir," Perry said, his voice unusually crisp in the haze. He kept irritation out of his tone. "Not to delay, but to aim. Blanket suspicion is like firing buckshot at a tank. It makes noise and achieves nothing. We need to find the crack, the weakest one, and drive a steel wedge into it with precision." Crawford's knuckles stopped. "And where is your wedge, Perry? The cabinet wants effects, not a thesis on methodology. You have 48 hours. 48 hours from now, I want a plan we can turn into action immediately, not another risk assessment." It was not negotiation. It was an ultimatum. The pressure did not make Perry panic. It was like a bucket of ice water, killing his last hope of luck and sharpening the outline of his thinking. He understood at once that the key was not what to say, but to whom and how to make them believe it. If he could not manufacture certainty, he could at least steer uncertainty into the one place where it would bite. He needed a unit unusually sensitive to Rommel's death, and he needed a weakness in that unit's internal trust. Something that would make an implied fact feel personally urgent. He opened a notebook and began to set down criteria in tight lines. Prestige, yes, but not prestige alone. Proximity to Rommel's myth, ideally a chain of personal loyalty, a command group proud enough to take offense at lies, and disciplined enough to treat rumor as a problem to solve. Then he began listing candidate formations, crossing out those that were too diffuse, too exhausted, too far from the story of Rommel. He was not looking for the largest target. He was looking for a single nerve. Over the next 36 hours, Perry turned himself into an intelligence sorting machine. He practically lived in the summary rooms and the listening archives, his eyes running over report after report. Movements of German formations on the Western Front, supply conditions, radio traffic patterns. He wasn't hunting for a sensational secret. He was hunting for an anomaly. A unit that fell strangely silent after the announcement. An officer in a POW cage who hesitated, just slightly, when Rommel was mentioned. He built crude matrices on scratch paper, unit names down one side, known commanders across the top, and small marks for any sign of attention, reverence, or unease. He compared prisoner statements about friendships and rivalries to signals diagrams that showed who spoke to whom and how often. Most of the time, the lines refused to connect. He discarded more pages than he kept. It was exhausting and most of the time fruitless. Then, late on October 21st, during the final hours before the 48-hour deadline, two documents that seemed unrelated collided in his mind. The first was a memo from the interrogation team attached to 21st Army Group. The initial questioning of a German major captured the day before. The major belonged to a hard, professional elite formation renowned even among the Germans, Panzer Lehr Division. The record itself was bland. The officer followed discipline, name, rank, number, nothing more. But the interrogator added a line of observation that looked almost incidental. The subject, when the phrase "the field marshal's legacy" was mentioned, showed a moment of contained anger and then asked too quickly whether Berlin's account had been confirmed. The second document was a transcript summary from the WWII service. A messy reel of intercepted traffic from the days after Rommel's death was announced. One entry, tagged "low priority and unclear," came from Panzer Lehr's radio network. An unidentified call sign attempted to contact the rear on a non-standard encrypted link and mentioned Berlin, clarification, and unofficial channels. The exchange broke off in interference, and the full content could not be recovered. Africa Corps ties. The commander's personal bond. Berlin needing an unofficial clarification. Perry leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the phrases spin until they began to lock into a shape. Panzer Lehr was well equipped, well trained, and treated as a cornerstone of the defense. If its commander held a personal reverence for Rommel that went beyond ordinary hierarchy, then doubts about Rommel's end would not be abstract politics. They would be a question about what Berlin was willing to do to its own icons and what it might do to anyone who had once stood too close to them. Panzer Lehr did not need to be disloyal to be vulnerable. It only needed to be proud and uncertain. A bold idea, almost arrogant, hit Perry in the haze of exhaustion and focus. The crack might not be in the massive body of the German army as a whole. It might be near the heart of this particular unit. Traditional black propaganda scattered doubt like leaflets to everyone. Perry's instinct was different. Refine doubt into a poison needle and inject it along a private chain of trust into the division's command corps. The aim was a localized but lethal avalanche of mistrust. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and wrote, hard, an operation code name, Scalpel. Then he listed the essentials. Target, the command layer of Panzer Lehr Division, especially Major General von Heimer and his inner circle. Method, forge a highly specific internal message that looked like it came from inside Berlin's power machinery, an ultra-sensitive warning implying Rommel's death was a purge signal and that the risk was spreading. Delivery, bypass conventional propaganda channels. Get it into their hands by a means that reached the target directly and could not be instantly dismissed as Allied fabrication. This was not propaganda, it was psychological decapitation by precision. Outside London stayed blacked out. On Perry's desk, the lamp threw the outline of the Scalpel plan into stark light. The 48-hour deadline had arrived. He had not found an answer. He had found the opening bid in a gamble, and the real problem was only beginning. The first step in turning Scalpel from paper into reality slammed into a technical wall. At a tightly controlled meeting inside the political warfare executive, Perry laid out the core problem without ornament. We need to create a document that looks like it just fell out of the pocket of an anxious insider at OKW, the high command of the armed forces in Berlin. Then we need to make Panzer Lehr's commander pick it up by accident, in a way that rules out Allied interference as the obvious explanation. Across the table sat the hand-picked nucleus of the Scalpel team. Edgar Wilson, a quiet forgery specialist whose fingertips always carried the faint scent of chemicals, had worked before the war in the authentication department of a famous auction house. He understood paper, ink, and print history down to the bone. Anna Kohler, born in Berlin and forced into exile by racial policy, spoke German so purely she could hear the difference between Prussian aristocrats and Bavarian farmers. She now handled transcription, translation, and the emotional read of intercepted recordings. And Malcolm Grace, a former signals intelligence officer invalided out of a frontline WWII service unit, knew German radio protocols, cipher habits, and call sign systems the way other men knew their own handwriting. Wilson spoke first, his voice as flat as a ruler. Standard leaflet paper and ink are traceable. Not acceptable. We need to match the OKW stationery used in a particular recent period, the kind with a nearly invisible watermark pattern adjusted under wartime austerity. The ink oxidation and bleed have to suggest at least 2 weeks of age, and the stamp is the hardest part. Not just an image, but pressure, ink distribution, even the worn corner where the real stamp has chipped over time. He pushed his glasses up. I need at least 3 genuine non-top secret OKW documents from different sources as samples. The newer the better, and I need a dedicated workspace with controlled humidity and temperature. Anna followed with the language trap. The forged text cannot be perfect. Perfect is suspicious. It needs a writer's small habits, a favored transitional phrase from a particular military academy, or the residue of a Berlin district's voice in formal prose. It also needs details that only a real insider would know, details that are trivial but correct. A corridor under renovation, a temporary shortage of rationed coffee. Those are credibility anchors. She looked at Perry. I need access to the most detailed linguistic analysis files from recent high-value German prisoners. The more granular, the better. Grace tackled the knot of delivery. Even if we make a flawless ghost document, how do we deliver it? A leaflet drop gets spotted as propaganda immediately, and it may never reach a general's desk. A clandestine agent? Too slow, too dangerous, and if exposed, the network burns. Broadcast, even disguised as a Free Germany station, gets located and labeled propaganda by their counter-listeners. He shook his head. We need a channel that isn't propaganda inside their own mental framework, a channel that reads as their own internal communications leaking by accident. The room fell quiet. The pressure that had been perched on Perry's shoulders spread outward and sat on everyone's chest. The demands were basic and unavoidable. Meeting them meant requesting sensitive resources from other departments, leaving records, increasing the risk of exposure. Perry did not have the luxury of hesitation. Using the limited special authority Crawford had granted him, masked as a high-priority propaganda materials validation effort, he began a tense scramble for resources. It meant typed requisitions, signatures that could later be traced, and careful phrasing that revealed urgency without revealing purpose. He met clerks in corridors and spoke in clipped euphemisms, aware that every extra name on a form was another potential question in a later audit. Even the calendar of appointments had to be managed so that no one noticed how often he crossed the building from one compartment to another. Wilson received several recent German regional command papers smuggled through special channels from the Dutch resistance. Anna was allowed access to parts of the deeper language analysis files for high-value prisoners. Grace disappeared into stacks of communications logs and signal reports, searching for the leak that might exist. 2 days later, on October 24th, inside Wilson's small, chemical-scented workshop, the first version of the ghost document took shape. It was a short-typed message copy on stationery nearly impossible to distinguish from the real thing. The header carried a blurred but correctly formatted internal reference number. The recipient line had been artfully obscured. The body was compact, cold, and bureaucratic. Regarding the subsequent handling of Field Marshal Rommel, the directive has been executed per the highest instruction. The external line must remain uniform. Internal evaluation indicates that this case may not be an isolated instance. Certain historical associations within the frontline command structure are being re-examined for loyalty reliability. This information is restricted to O-grade officers. Any written record must be destroyed under special procedure. Following this transmission, this channel will enter silence. The language was standard staff German, restrained and official. But words like historical associations and re-examined carried an unstated threat. Anna read it closely and made one tiny adjustment. Before the verb executed, she inserted a mild adverb common in senior Berlin officers' writing, a note of reluctant necessity, regretful, but done. Forging the document had reached a key milestone. The delivery channel remained a deadlock. Grace tested options, injecting coded bursts into simulated German night check signals, slipping content into the stream at moments of weak verification. He rejected them all as too easily flagged by competent signal analysts as external interference. Frustration began to seep into the room. Time crawled toward midnight on October 25th. The break came on the afternoon of the 25th, inside a quarterly analysis summary on German radio security on the Western Front. Grace flipped pages almost mechanically until a footnote caught his eye. It noted that certain elite divisional-level German units, especially armored formations, had begun using a non-standard, low-power backup command frequency to counter increasingly aggressive Allied jamming. The system was not on continuously. Its transmission windows were short. Its signal characteristics were deliberately engineered to resemble background noise, making sustained capture and direction finding difficult. Most importantly, because the system was emergency and informal, its identity verification tended to be weaker and more dependent on familiarity than on strict authentication. Grace sat upright as if shocked. He grabbed the summary and went straight for Perry's office. "I think I have it," he said, practically bursting through the door. "Not a forced break-in, an imitation of an internal cross-line, a ghost echo." Perry grasped it immediately. "You mean the backup emergency channel? At the moment they're likely to use it, we simulate a weak rear area signal, warped, broken by interference, containing fragments of our message. They think they've overheard their own people leaking a few dangerous words because of a communications fault." "Exactly." Grace drew a crude timing chart on Perry's desk. "We need a handle on when Panzer Lehr is likely to open that backup band, even approximately. We need to replicate their unit-level recognition signal. We can reverse engineer it from the occasional emergency traffic we've caught in the past. Then, at the critical moment, with a transmitter tuned to match their power signature and waveform habits, we push the ghost document's core into a short burst, heavily noisy, degraded, intermittent, like you're catching scraps of a conversation you were never meant to hear." It was elegant and reckless. Technically, it was a tightrope act. It demanded accurate prediction of enemy behavior patterns, precise signal craft, and immaculate timing. Any misstep could expose the operation, prompting the Germans to harden their procedures. Perry stared at the timing chart and felt his pulse quicken. It was not safe. It was a scalpel, precise, lethal, and unforgiving, and if it worked, the enemy would search for the flaw inside itself before it looked outward. "We need help from a Royal Air Force Special Electronic Warfare Detachment," Perry said, deciding without hesitation. "They can do the directional signal simulation. Grace, you and I will draft the technical parameters and an assessment of the window. Wilson, convert the final text into a coding scheme that fits German low-bandwidth emergency habits. Anna, check every language detail one last time, so that if they hear only a few words, those words still carry threat and authenticity." As night fell again, Scalpel finally crossed from concept to a countdown. Every detail was ground down, tested, verified. The air held a mix of sharp anxiety and a strange excitement. Everyone in the room understood that the next attempt might no longer be a rehearsal. The night of October 27th was cold and clear. The sky was moonless, perfect cover for a special Royal Air Force task. Near a concealed radar site in southeast England, a modified communications van sat under camouflage netting. The interior was cramped, packed with delicate equipment and operators whose faces had gone taut. Richard Perry and Malcolm Grace were in the van too. Through a narrow observation slit, there was only blackness and a few faint navigation lights in the distance. Their window was under 45 minutes, the best estimate after days of analysis for when Panzer Lehr might briefly open its backup emergency frequency to run a check. Everything was ready. Wilson's forged Berlin warning had been converted into a digital sequence that fit German low-bandwidth emergency coding conventions. Anna had vetted key German words embedded in the encoding and how they would sound under simulated distortion, ensuring the core meaning would still be recognizable even through noise. The RAF specialists had tuned the transmitter's power and signal characteristics to a dangerous balance, close enough to background interference to look natural, strong enough to be caught. "Frequency locked, signature loaded," a technician murmured into his headset, eyes fixed on a scope where a green waveform jumped. Grace checked the timing chart and the unit recognition code one last time. He nodded to Perry. Perry's throat felt dry. He drew in a breath and spoke to the young RAF lieutenant directing the injection. "Proceed as planned. May we be lucky enough or may they be unlucky enough. Injection sequence, start. Countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, transmit." There was no roar, no drama, only the soft click of relays and the low hum of current. The encoded message, doubt compressed into a weapon, went out as a short burst of warped radio energy layered with carefully simulated storm noise aimed toward the night over eastern France. It was an invisible ghost trying to slip into the enemy's guarded hearing. The transmission lasted 12 seconds, then the van sank into deeper silence broken only by cooling fans. The first phase was done. No one knew whether it had landed. They cut all active emissions and went into absolute radio quiet, like hunters who have thrown a lure and must now become invisible. The next 28 hours were the longest, most punishing wait of Perry's professional life. On the surface, the political warfare executive in London ticked on, typewriters clacking, colleagues discussing other projects, but Perry felt as if he stood on the lip of a silent volcano, waiting for the faintest tremor. He did his best to look routine. He answered ordinary questions, signed mundane minutes, and kept his voice level because sudden intensity drew attention. When he caught himself staring at the second hand of a clock, he forced himself to look away and pick up another file, as if his mind could be disciplined like a junior clerk. He replayed every step of Scalpel, searching for a missed seam. Every small worry grew teeth. Grace planted himself in a corner of the signals room, listening with near-obsessive focus to anything even loosely tied to Panzer Lehr's known channels, hunting for a sign. The first 24 hours were calm. The division's routine traffic showed no obvious change. The listening summaries contained no explicit mention of Berlin, unauthorized message, or internal investigation. A suffocating sense of failure started to spread. Maybe the signal hadn't been received. Maybe it had been received and dismissed as noise. Maybe the backup channel hadn't been open at the moment they guessed. The shift came late on October 29th, almost grudgingly, in the form of an ordinary frontline intelligence compilation delivered to Perry's desk. Tucked inside was a one-page initial findings summary from the WWII service marked low confidence, pending verification. Over the past 18 hours, it said, Panzer Lehr's communications pattern had shown non-typical fluctuations. The division headquarters' encrypted traffic with a subordinate regimental-level unit had spiked sharply in a short span. More strikingly, the division and its rear area Army Group headquarters had conducted a rare query using a non-standard encryption protocol. Blurred keyword matching suggested source verification and communication security review. The originator was identified as Panzer Lehr's division command post. Perry's pulse jumped. He went straight to Grace, and together they matched the summary against every relevant fragment from the last 2 days. They pulled the logbooks and the frequency plots, checking timestamps against the injection window and against every thin anomaly that had previously seemed meaningless. Grace rewound one reel and ran his finger along a column of notes, comparing one operator's shorthand to another's to ensure they were describing the same signature. Perry began a separate timeline on a clean sheet, not trusting his memory to do the arithmetic under strain. The work was meticulous and slow, and neither man spoke until the pattern began to show its bones. "Here," Grace said, pointing to a frequency record where a faint anomaly barely rose above the noise floor. "The timing fits. The frequency is close but not identical. That could be leakage when they opened the backup channel to confirm internally. And here, this packet length and exchange tempo on the main net is well above normal command needs. It reads like repeated checking or an argument." The signs were subtle, but the direction was clear. The bait had been touched. Something had made the enemy uncertain, and they had begun a verification process. That was exactly the reaction Perry had wanted. Not panic, but confusion and vigilance. The trust chain had begun to take strain. The real breakthrough came late on the 29th. A high-priority operational signal arrived from the Intelligence Coordination Desk at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force and was put directly in front of Crawford and Perry. The content was brief and jarring. Per a credible source, channel withheld, German Panzer Lehr Division had scheduled a company-level tactical counterattack for the morning of October 30th local time at Hill 312 sector, grid N17/E09. Hours ago, the division commander, Major General von Heimer, personally ordered the action canceled. The stated reason, vaguely phrased in the order, was the need to clarify synchronization of the current command chain and superior intent. Allied forward observation posts confirm no significant enemy movements are in progress. Clarification of the command chain. A tactical action canceled because intent wasn't synchronized. Perry could almost see it. A German command post where an unseen whisper had lodged in a general's mind. The ghost message's implied threat had diffused like ink in water through von Heimer's decision-making. It could spark suspicion about Berlin's true motives, anxiety about which colleagues might be marked, fear that his own past association with Rommel had become a liability. That kind of internal, unspoken insecurity corroded the foundation of military decision, whether to commit men into risk. "They didn't ignore our signal," Perry said to Crawford, his voice rough with contained excitement. "They received it. They're confused, and they're binding themselves because of that confusion. The Scalpel cut." Crawford stared at the message without expression, but his knuckles finally stopped their habitual tapping. After a long moment, he spoke. "That means delay in their command system. For Patton's people, any delay is gold. Keep the highest priority listening, Perry. I want to know what thorns this seed grows." Perry returned to his corner. Outside, London lay under a heavy night. The first flush of triumph had settled into a colder focus. The most dangerous, most delicate portion had only begun. They had introduced the virus. Now they had to watch how it replicated inside the host's own systems and what kind of dysfunction it would produce. Panzer Lehr's hesitation was the first loosened brick. The chain reaction was beginning to lift its curtain somewhere in the dark and fog along the front. By early November, cold winds swept the high ground of eastern France, bringing icy rain and mud. Roads turned to slurry under the weight of armor and lorries, and every movement became louder and slower. Field telephones and temporary cables suffered in the wet, and radio operators fought a constant battle with damp sets and interference. Orders that should have taken minutes sometimes took an hour, arriving half confirmed and half contested. General George Patton's Third Army, like a steel spring held down too long, finally received orders to push with full force. One axis of the advance aimed directly into the sector held by Panzer Lehr, the same sector where command chain clarification had already produced hesitation. From November 2nd through November 4th, the fighting broke out in driving rain and bitter wind. The first contacts were probing, but Allied frontline commanders soon noticed something wrong. Panzer Lehr's positions, usually bristling and hard to crack, responded in a way that felt scattered and disconnected. Artillery counterfire was less concentrated and periodically cut off. Some pre-sighted crossfire points stayed silent for no clear reason. When Allied reconnaissance units attempted flanking probes, local German countermoves came late or came from the wrong direction, as if the unit's nervous system could no longer agree on where pain was located. It did not look like an elite unit deliberately drawing an enemy in. It looked like a giant whose limbs were receiving contradictory instructions, moving stiffly and out of rhythm. In London, Perry and Grace barely left the signals room. More fragments arrived through different channels, slowly assembling a clearer picture of how the internal infection was taking hold. A partially decrypted internal message showed a regimental commander in Panzer Lehr's armored infantry element receiving a vaguely phrased defensive adjustment order from division and responding with an unusually blunt demand for written confirmation and sharper mission boundaries. A forward listening report described an intercepted low-level exchange on the division's net, emotional and undisciplined. A soldier complaining that they up top don't even know where they want us to hold, so how are we supposed to know? The most persuasive evidence came in an expedited summary transferred from Schaef's psychological warfare staff late on November 4th, acquired through special channels. It was an intercepted snippet from communications between the German headquarters in the West and an Army group staff. Bureaucratic phrasing wrapped around a sharp point. A query about Panzer Lehr's recent abnormal tactical performance. Inside the formal language, one sentence stood out. Major General von Heimer has been unable to provide a convincing operational rationale for the division's uncoordinated withdrawal in the Hill 312 sector, repeatedly citing only the need to ensure absolute clarity of command intent. His mental condition and judgment reliability have attracted the attention of the Army Group Chief of Staff. They moved from questioning orders to questioning the man giving them, Perry said to Crawford when he arrived, his tone controlled but his eyes cold and bright. The ghost message didn't make them surrender or defect. It did something more lethal. It poisoned trust. The commander doubts whether Berlin still trusts him. The regimental commander doubts whether the commander is clear-headed. The soldiers doubt whether any order means what it used to. When a military nervous system is infected with self-doubt, every decision becomes a negotiation with fear. Crawford looked at the report spread over the table. After a pause, he asked, "And has Patton's blade gone in?" The answer came on the afternoon of November 5th, not as a briefing, but as a high-level operational success report from the front. One of Patton's armored combat commands, exploiting a weak seam that had opened because Panzer Lehr and a neighboring infantry division failed to coordinate, executed a bold penetration thrust. German reaction was slow. Reserve movements were chaotic. The seam tore open quickly. Panzer Lehr's flank lay exposed, sliding toward encirclement. In the ensuing disordered withdrawal, the division abandoned a startling amount of heavy equipment, including at least 12 Panther tanks that could not be repaired or towed in time, and large numbers of assault guns. Allied aerial reconnaissance photographs showed rearward roads littered with abandoned German vehicles and materiel. The tactical breakthrough had been achieved. And it had happened at the exact psychological fault line Scalpel had aimed for. On November 7th, an assessment document bearing the formal seal of Schaef's psychological warfare staff arrived at the political warfare executive. It praised the recent innovative psychological pressure testing directed at a specific elite German unit and stated that the action had successfully induced verifiable decision delay and internal coordination breakdown in the target command, creating critical favorable conditions for an Allied breakthrough in the Hill 312 sector. The document did not mention Scalpel or Perry by name, but when Crawford handed Perry a copy, he tapped two phrases hard with his finger: innovative and critical. That same day, Perry received a secure call from a senior official in Schaeff's psychological warfare shop. The voice on the line was brief. That report about clarification. The effects were significant. Clean work, Mr. Perry. The operation was over, and it had succeeded far beyond the initial expectation. It had not merely raised doubt, it had materially helped push an elite enemy division into tactical collapse at a decisive moment. The fruit of that victory was cold and hard and undeniable. On the morning of November 8th, a light rain fell over London, washing the gray buildings. Perry stayed alone in his office to finalize the archive. All the documents, wavelength records, forged samples, and analysis reports would be sealed into a file box marked in bureaucratic code, corrosive agent, follow-on assessment, closed. He logged the box's contents in the registry, initialed each line, and marked which papers had been duplicated for the secure index. The forged samples went into a separate sleeve, sealed with tape, and the seal number was recorded twice, once in his hand and once by a clerk who did not know what the papers meant. For anything that could not safely be stored, he prepared destruction slips and ensured the burn record matched the inventory, because loose ends in London were as dangerous as loose ends at the front. He did not merely toss the material in. He checked each item against a list, made sure the order was consistent, and verified that nothing sensitive had been left on his desk or in his drawers, where a casual glance could become a question. Outside, the city woke. Streetcars rang. Early commuters hurried under umbrellas. Newspaper headlines might carry news of distant gains, but no one would know that part of that gain came from an unseen unraveling born here. Perry picked up the Scaife assessment copy and set it down again. There would be no rousing celebration, no medal pinned in public, only the soft sound of the archive box lid closing. He went to the window and looked out at the wet street and the blurred silhouette of St. Paul's. A strange calm settled over him. He thought of the communications van sending a ghost signal into the night, of the carefully forged message packed with coded menace, of a German commander's hand hesitating because suspicion had entered his mind. War was steel and fire, arrows advancing on maps. But Perry had just proven another war beneath those arrows before the artillery thunder, a quieter, more lethal war. It did not destroy tanks. It corroded the will that drove them. It did not bomb positions. It hollowed out the belief that held them. The strongest fortress could begin to crack from a whisper in a commander's head, a whisper that could not be proved and could not be dismissed. True victory was not only planting a flag on a ridge, it was making the enemy lose, in his own shadow, the reason to fight. Perry drew the curtains, shutting out the gray light and the city noise. The room returned to dimness and quiet. He slipped off his coat and draped it over the chair as if taking off invisible armor. The archive box lay in the corner like an unremarkable gravestone, marking a piece of history known to only a handful, yet real enough to change the fates of men at the front. The war continued far away. Here, a man who had used information like a scalpel had done his task and locked the cold lesson back inside himself. He turned and left. His footsteps echoed down the empty corridor, fading into the ordinary noise of the day.